Welcome back to the last week of methods. So today and Thursday, we will be eagerly listening to your final presentations. I browsed through the slides you posted, thank you. I saw a lot of exciting stuff that happened since the last time we talked about your project, which was, I don't know, closer to the beginning of the semester. So I have to say, I'm very proud of everything you've accomplished, and I look forward to hearing more about it. So good job. Thanks for engaging and doing all this stuff. All right, so I'm going to pass this off to Jenny to tell us the rules of engagement.
Yeah, because I have been de facto elected as session chair for the next 2 days. So we have, I think, 16 presentations. I might struggle with counting, so like 4. So everyone's going to get 10 minutes total. We're going to try to shoot for 7 for the presentation, 3 minutes for questions, but we have like that extra buffer if you need more than 7. And I will, at like the 3-minute mark, throw up like a 3. So just keep your eyes out for that. And then I'll tell you when the 1 minute is left. So to give you a sense of time. So yeah. And also 0, probably, because that's all.
You mean 3 minutes until 7?
Yeah, all right, 3 minutes left, 1 minute left, no time.
Until 7 or until 10?
Until 7.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you I'll make sure to try to direct it so that if you need the extra time past 0, like we'll make sure that everyone else.
At some point, you turn the lights on and off.
Yeah.
Anybody going beyond 7 will get a minus 1,000. The final grade. But you have that option there, just in case you need.
I don't do the points, that's all. So
You do the timer.
Yeah, you could just
Can
lie.
you extend the seconds, please?
You have the choice to just lie.
Let's do it.
Okay,
You're on. There should be audio on at the top of the table there, and you're welcome to go to the front and present and do whatever you're comfortable with.
okay. So I'm like giving myself presenter view because I'm crazy. Okay. Do you want me to stand or can I be sitting?
Whatever you want to do is fine.
Okay, so I was debating how to present my project for today, and I settled on a story of learning empirical methods while doing empirical research. Next, please.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so when I started this project, I was thinking of it like an experiment to test a hypothesis on a given treatment, right? So we know that people, even under the most artificial circumstances, if they develop a group identity, they will favor their in-group members and then therefore discriminate against out-group members. And that's even if you say you're in a randomly assigned group, A and B, people still develop this behavior. But what we don't know is how does computer-mediated communication affect that group identity? And how can we influence that group identity with algorithms or with a change in the design of our platforms? And so at the time that I proposed this project, this slide is about all the work that I had to show for it. So I designed this virtual experiment paradigm where participants join, they take a short questionnaire, then they're assigned a group based on that questionnaire. They have a moderated conversation where we give them a topic and they talk about it. And then they have a cooperation game where we quantitatively analyze how much trust they build, how much identity they build with their partner. And then we finally give them a survey asking them about their experience. So mostly quantitative methods, we're evaluating their attitude towards their partner quantitatively with this game step. But I added a qualitative analysis through the conversation in the survey to enrich and validate the results that we get quantitatively. But you see, I completely changed this paradigm pretty quickly to add this essay task, which would, I hoped, would incentivize better conversation and then add an extra qualitative unit, which we could analyze to see how people think about their partner. And this essay task is, I want you to write a report about your partner's opinion. So in the conversation, I give them a prompt to discuss their opinions about a certain topic, and then they must report on their partner's opinion, not their own. So the first half of the semester, I developed this web app, which is the realization of my virtual experiment. So here you see a screenshot of the questionnaire for one of the types of grouping, and people choose, do they think society has a responsibility to help poor people or not? And in the second half of the semester, I ran several pilot trials to see if this experimental paradigm would even be successful. And so the development of the experiment itself is not really that interesting, except that it was done in Groovy, which was torturous. It constantly throws exceptions, which have no line number or like even file name. So I just sifted through 20 files at a time to find that. Oh, you can go to the next slide, yeah. And this is a screenshot of the chat. So I give them a prompt, they chat about it. I give them some tips because people really struggled to chat successfully. And struggle is a theme of the next several slides. So the first challenge I encountered during the pilot is that communication is really difficult for a lot of these participants. So these ones, I do like bot filtering and still, it's hard for me to say that this is a human. Next slide, please. And then even if they do have meaningful discussion, like these people are having a good discussion, except one of the person in white ends up reporting the person in gray because they disagree with them and they're kind of misrepresenting the rules of engagement. You're allowed to talk about your personal life, but you're not allowed to give your like social security number.
Yeah.
So I was struggling with this and I asked the Oracle of DALL-E like why I'm struggling. And I realized it's because my subjects are cat. But in all seriousness, I met with my advisor and a professor at LTI, and they said, Eli, like conducting the actual experiment means that your research is basically finished and that I need to shift my thinking from explanatory to more exploratory for the rest of my time doing this pilot. And through that, I discovered, I ran a couple more pilot trials and I explored the data instead of trying to explain it. And I discovered this pattern of labeling. So participants would say their socioeconomic class for no reason. They would describe like, I'm middle, I'm left, I'm right, which we also don't ask them to do. They would say like their general emotional response to the economy. And then you can go to the next slide. And when they don't do that, they just magically get along. And so the next one is an example of this. It's a different grouping method where we ask about art instead of their political beliefs. And these people have a great time. They're like saying, have a good day, communicating completely successfully. And so from this exploration, I realized that the challenges and the inklings of patterns that are not like well-defined yet are symbolic of like real problems that do exist, right? There is this group discrimination that's occurring, but the experiment design is not refined enough yet to be able to draw those out. And so for the next month, I intend on refining the experiment to successfully isolate those variables and then work towards this evidence-based intervention strategy for how participants can successfully develop like shared identity, even in the face of salient group memberships. And that is, we can end on this slide.
Is there a reason why you started off with asking things like political affiliations to try to measure in-group and out-group versus, you know, your art interests later?
Right. So yes, there is a reason for that. And the reason is we develop our social identity. There's this theory that we develop social identity based on like groups that we feel identity with. And so this political identity is one of those things where if we have a label of the group that we're in, that's part of our social identity. Whereas a label for like what type of art you like is not something we normally use for social identity. And so it's kind of an interesting comparison of like, there's this added layer of difficulty when in our society, this group identity matters a lot more than others, for example.
Courtney? Courtney? Maybe not.
I thought Courtney was just laughing.
Oh. Sorry, I misinterpreted that as a raised hand. My bad. Any?
I have a question, probably because I was thinking of the different questions. So your question was, I think in the beginning you said your question is to study how this like same identity group behavior was mediated by computers.
Yeah.
And how does your experiment answer that question?
Right. So the way that it answers that question is first, by being an online chat scenario, like you're not speaking to your partner, you don't get to see their face, you don't have any of the normal social cues for who they are as a person. And so that is part of the mediation. Another part is the intervention, which we haven't even designed yet. And that will determine, so like smart reply suggestions, for example. So we give the participant like a button where it's like, we recommend you to respond in this very polite way to your partner who's saying very impolite things.
Okay, so the real experiment is not a comparison between communication on computer platform versus offline.
Correct, it's not that.
About like an action, sign, or okay.
Yeah, we have one. So we can-
Sounds good. Thank you again.
Otherwise.
Then can you move the speaker over so?
Oh, is that the microphone?
Yes.
Nice.
Okay.
I suspect that you can actually advance slides yourselves.
How?
Is that true?
By what mechanism?
I'm not entirely sure, but I've seen people do that. I thought it was magic.
Maybe they have a pointer that's connected to your computer and then they just hold the pointer.
Yes, that is also
Ah.
a very good idea.
Martin's like, it's magic. Oh, wait, I have the magic.
I thought it was something about it being a shared thing.
You can
Some-
share like your
there's a
interactions
share
and let people click on your
That's so
screen.
sweet.
But I
Yeah,
had,
there's like this request remote control.
Yeah.
I don't know if Ray has that. Right?
No, it
It's
does.
true,
It
because,
does.
like,
I did that for a study. on-
Yeah, I don't know how they do it. It's something magic.
I was a participant in a study that did.
Nice. Well, this works. Cool.
Nice.
The big arrow is the one
The
that
big arrow. Cool.
advances.
Right.
Very nice.
The big one. Yeah. Cool. So hello, we are Matt and Sam, and we are here to talk about our study on testing tools. Specifically, question is, there are all these tools for generating tests. Do they actually do anything? Because there's been a lot of research on like these sorts of tests in the past, where it's like you have a tool to generate like a test suite for like some sort of software suite, and like you ask questions about like, does this actually help programmers in any meaningful way? And they run studies, and the studies come up negative. This is all kind of stuff that we talked about before. So the way that we like propose, just like as a quick recap, the way that we propose to address this by saying like, if we have an implicit oracle, and look, we kind of constrain the task, then these tools are going to be able to help programmers like identify bugs more quickly and with higher confidence and more accurately. We created this tool called NanoFuzz, which is a prototype kind of test generation tool. And then we've related these to research questions about whether people can find bugs faster, and whether they're more confident or less confident.
So, we've been running a 6-task randomized between subjects A/B user study with TypeScript programmers. So we're about 20 of 30 participants through so far. So we've completed 20. And so we were originally going to make this a within subjects design. But with the way we have arrayed our tasks, we actually can't figure out how to do the stats. So, and we were really hoping to do within subjects because we could get by with fewer participants, right? Have stronger statistical power.
Yeah.
So we've changed it to a between subjects design. And just added more participants. Let's see. So, and the study design is the same, that we talked about a few months ago. So there's 6 tasks. We split participants into 2 groups randomly, and then one group starts with the intervention treatment, and then does the control treatment, back and forth, right? They alternate, through those tasks. And the other group just starts with the opposite order, right? They start with the control, and then the intervention, and the control, et cetera. So we have two parts of it. We have a quantitative piece. So for each task, we're collecting 6 different measures. And then at the end, we collect some data on the system usability scale, which is kind of a common HCI scale for measuring usability. And then from a qualitative standpoint, we have a free-form post survey where folks are kind of writing about their experiences with the tools that we're using to extract themes using thematic analysis.
So when we were putting together these slides, as you can see, they're kind of similar to the slides we had at the beginning, because I didn't realize how much time there would be for this presentation. So the rest we can just talk without slides. So we, as Matt mentioned, we ran about 10 pilots, and then we've been running, you said, like about 20 like of the actual studies. We learned a lot from running the pilots. Like I was kind of worried that 10 would be too many, but like we kept learning more stuff and adjusting the study as we went on. Some things that we learned early on was, you can see here that we use the word bug. We actually ended up removing that entirely from our protocol. And the reason is because of our, I don't know how to go back. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so our hypothesis about this implicit oracle in our study design, we were specifically asking participants to look for like input-output pairs of the program, such that like the input satisfies the specification constraints and the output like contains one of these sorts of values that our oracle is looking for. And so what ended up happening, because we were using the word bug, is programmers would instead be thinking about like, what should this program do like morally, right? Like, what's the right thing for this program to do? And so like they spent a lot of time thinking about this. They spent a lot of time like also like putting in inputs that weren't allowed in the input space that was specified. So we had to like adjust, like make a lot of adjustments to our protocol to like make it clear what actually was the task that they were looking for them to do. And even now, like in the study, it's like still, it's not perfect. Like still, people still get confused, but the pilots help make it a lot less confusing. And so like generally people are able to understand that. I don't know if there were other insights that we got.
It's really hard to recruit professional software engineers.
Yeah.
It's really tough. Yeah.
Is that the sample? Is that who you've been recruiting?
Right.
Yeah.
So we've been recruiting professional software.
So
How do you find it?
our constraints are like, you have to have at least 1 year of professional development experience, and you have to know some TypeScript, which turns out to be not challenging. Like, I mean, not trivial. So like, I was talking to Josh earlier today, and he was like, maybe we should have done Python instead. Like, probably would have had an easier time finding people.
You're gonna find enough to finish it?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. We have another 5 scheduled, and so we need to just get a broom and go, track down 5 more. Yeah.
Sorry, how were you recruiting people?
Oh, yeah. So a variety of different ways, right? So there's some papers that say that there's no good way to sample software engineers that are professionals, right? And so you could probably best describe what we're doing as a convenience sample. So we're using, relationships, we're using LinkedIn, we're using Twitter, we're using Mastodon, we're using email, we're using, contacts with folks that we know. We're doing kind of a form of snowball sampling. So if we reach out to you and you know some folks, please feel free to forward on the invitation, to friends, family who happen to meet the requirements. That's how we're recruiting.
Have we actually gotten any through like indirect?
No. So the IRB, they have told us that we have to do it that way, snowball sampling. We didn't challenge it for the study, but we found that is not effective. It's not effective. We have gotten exactly 0 recruits that way.
Have you tried, this is just a suggestion, I've used freelancing platforms like Upwork in the past. I mean, obviously, it's if it's US only, there's a lot of overseas people on there, so, but yeah.
Yeah.
How much do you need to pay to get this professional and this really expensive?
Yeah. So we actually have a paper and submission about that. And so in the past, we've typically not paid, right? Because folks it's really hard to equitably compensate software engineers for their time, right? And typically they're busy, right? So usually if they're doing it, they're kind of doing it, for science or, for some other reason. And consequently, we do pay for this study. We're paying $30 for a 90-minute, time, and we recognize, we tell them, hey, we know that this does not compensate you for your time. Thank you. Thank you for being part of the study. But I mean, there's a paper by Doug Schoberg where I think he spent 50,000 euros recruiting software engineers, and he gets to the end, he says, I still don't have enough participants. So great stuff. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. Yeah, we did not spend $50,000 on the study, by the way. Yeah. Like it, right?
Who's next? You're in control. Hey, buddy. Do you have the remote thing so you can advance the slides yourself? Did anybody figure out how to do that?
The remote.
That sounds too much.
We're you can tell me to advance slides. There's a magic
Sure.
way with Google Slides. Apparently you could control it yourself, even if I'm the one sharing. But I don't know how to do that just yet. We're trying to figure that out. In the meantime, you can
Okay.
just-
If you look,
I don't have it.
if you look at the Zoom window, there's a little green bar that says you are viewing Bogdan's screen. Next to that, it says view options. If you click on that,
Ah,
that's remote.
Oh,
Uh-oh.
cool. All right. Can you all hear me okay?
So
That's
great.
awesome. Yeah, cool.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, hi. So the title of the project I'm going to share with you is A Golf Course Walks into a River, Stakeholder Conflict in the Upper Truckee River Restoration Project. So the context, like I said, is a golf course walks into a river. In the 1960s, a golf course was developed on the banks of the Upper Truckee River, which is the largest tributary to Lake Tahoe, which sits on the border of California and Nevada in the Sierra Nevada mountains. So this golf course has been around for about 60 years, and very few upgrades or infrastructure maintenance has happened there. The golf course happens to be located on land that is owned by the California State Park System, and there's a significant river restoration challenge happening. The banks of the river are eroding. The golf course is located in the historic floodplain of the river, and the golf course floods every year. Meanwhile, sediment from the eroding banks flows into the Lake Tahoe headwaters and causes the lake to lose clarity over time. So for the last 15 years, the state park system has been trying to plan and execute a river restoration project, but it has been held back many times by lawsuits and lengthy environmental regulation processes. Right now, there is an outstanding proposal that's being reviewed, and the question I am asking is sort of timely because action is happening, which is, why is there seemingly intractable conflict over river restoration in the Lake Valley Recreation Area? You can see on the map there, that's where the golf, you see clearly, I think on the map, there's a golf course and there's a river, and they are overlapping. I looked at some theory from a case study in the Skagit Valley in Washington, where the author generated some theory around why there's conflict in ecological restoration projects. The author identified 4 main sources, which are stakeholders can't agree on what the problem is. Stakeholders use different kinds of knowledge and sources of legitimacy. Stakeholders have different senses of place and land management philosophies, and they are divided by actual and perceived injustices and mistrust. So I wanted to see if any of that theory was present here, with the ultimate goal of figuring out ways as a designer and a community member that I might intervene to help the project be more successful and actually move forward. Because the conflict has been so intractable, nothing has happened to address the golf course issue or the river issue. So that is what my research is trying to get to the heart of. To do that, I used a combination of qualitative analysis and a little bit of network analysis to do an exploratory mixed method study. I initially thought I would interview restoration stakeholders in my area, but I came across, like, I wanted to do a more general study of restoration in my area, and I was actually approached by someone at the farmer's market seeking public comment about this particular project. And that really struck me as an opportunity to get involved and interested. So I found this awesome, easily available public data source, which is the public scoping report. It's 217 pages and involves 52 actual real public comments that have been made in the last year. So I use that as the basis for my analysis. So I was able to do a qualitative analysis. I did 2 rounds, 2 or 3 rounds based on the public comments. From that, I found that there were 3 primary stakeholder groups involved in the conflict, at least based on what I could see in the scoping report. There's a group of people that sort of represent the perspective of environmental compliance, state parks and other affiliated agencies. There's a group of folks that would, I think, have the attitude of being environmentalists. It's private people as well as nonprofits. And then there's another group of what I called recreation business. It's the golf course and other recreation people, and like the Chamber of Commerce and other folks in the community. And then I found that comments generally had 3 different kinds of information. Comments about the problem, how the stakeholder group saw the problem, ideas that they had about the solution, and other information that should be considered. For the sake of simplicity, I took the codes just from the solution category and then did network visualization. I'm going to call it visualization more than analysis, and you'll see what I came up with. But what was cool about that is I found 3 main groupings of solution codes that corresponded well with the previously identified stakeholder groups that I found in the qualitative analysis. What I found overall is basically aligns pretty well with at least some of the theory that I had initially identified. A big part of the restoration challenge is multiple and divergent understandings of what the problem is, as well as what the solution should be. The recreation business folks spoke very little of the river in their comments and quite a lot about how great the golf course is. The environmentalists spoke not much about the golf course and quite a lot about the river and the landscape. And the environmental compliance folks tend to speak about both. Some studies environmental restoration challenge this theory that Westerners have primarily aesthetic, modernist, rational, individualistic, and capitalistic relationships with nature. But I was not able to find anything in my searching that would refute that idea. So that maybe outdated theories has not been, I've not found any evidence to the contrary. I found primarily aesthetic and capitalistic relationships to nature being represented in the dialogue. So what I did here for the network visualization, it's a little messy, but what I did was take the solution codes as well as the commenters and made them all nodes. Then I used directional edges to represent edges in a directional fashion to represent when a commenter used a particular code about what they thought the solution should be. And then I had the software represent the nodes to be larger based on their amount of in degree. So basically how often that comment is being surfaced. So you see 3 clusters. On the left is sort of the recreation business ideas about the solution. They're really concerned that the golf course should remain 18 holes, that the infrastructure should be upgraded, and mountain biking connectivity should be prioritized. The compliance folks are sort of up on the top. They're thinking about historic conditions and geologic processes, and the environmentalists are sort of on the right. They say we should not use tax money for golf course fixes. We need different recreation opportunities and a greater range of alternatives considered. So I appreciated that this application of network analysis showed the same groupings of solutions, and maybe that these folks are mostly talking to each other. This raises also an interesting question around ethics and confidentiality. I see this person in the middle called Kathy Strain. Kathy Strain's really interesting because their comments are, they made solution comments that connected to the 3 different groups. So they're an interesting person in this mix, bringing the 3 groups together. But, you know, Kathy Strain did not consent to be in my research. I found Kathy's comments online and I'm analyzing them. So obviously for any publication or future work, I think I should anonymize the participants and also consider whether or not it's appropriate to even use these public comments as a basis for research. That is where I will leave us. Need to actually talk to stakeholders to validate if this is real, and the goal is overall to find opportunities for ways of bringing people together so that the project can move forward.
Thanks.
We have time for maybe one.
It's more of a comment than a question. I know the meme. It's not like there's a recording on YouTube or anything where you mention Kathy's name, right? Or anything like that.
Sorry.
But more of a comment than a question about how there's a recording on YouTube, you know, mentioning Kathy's name.
Of this, right?
You know, our conversation just now, but maybe I won't post the recording or edit this out from today.
Okay, sure. Yeah, sorry about that. I sort of backed into it as I was I guess I'm trying to share my learnings out loud with you all. I started the project feeling like, oh, this data set is publicly available. I can use it for my research with no questions or issues. And then as I got further into it, I realized that, oh, these are real people with real concerns who live in this community, and I should make sure that I'm respectful of that in how I report on it. So.
Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing. We see this on the open source, the developers that we study in my group. It's the same thing. You know, people's names and identities are online and public, but you know, maybe we have a responsibility to protect the right somehow. So I think the common practice is to anonymize this kind of data before publishing about it.
I have a very quick question. You mentioned there was theories about like why conflict happen. Is there any empirical study that try to validate this theory, and what are their findings?
I found typically the theory comes from specific cases. I wasn't able to find, you know, across a multi-site analysis. Usually this work is done by anthropologists, and they tend to be focused on really specific cases. So the theory that I found was about this one valley in this one part of Washington state. And I was thinking, oh, I wonder if there are similar dynamics here. Yeah. But they also used empirical methods. They interviewed 100 people, something like that.
Okay, look, Jenny's making angry faces, so
No, it's not.
we're gonna move on. Thank you,
Thanks.
Jenny. Who has the? Never mind, Courtney.
Yeah, it's me now. I'm gonna request remote control. Great. How do I change your screen though? Sorry, so I have allegedly control, but like, how do I switch slides?
Was that you?
Maddie, how did you do it? No, that was not me. That was you, Courtney. I didn't do anything.
Oh, it's just delayed, huh? Okay, hi. All right, we're all here now. Okay, Jenny, you can start the time now. So this project is called Death, Hard to Prepare For, Harder to Avoid, Strategies for the Sustainable Use of Open Source Dependencies. The title has actually changed. It's now When the Lights Aren't On in Nobody's Home, Strategies to Deal with Open Source Dependency Abandonment, but I digress. So the motivation of this project is that I dare say that many of us in the room already know that open source is important. And if we didn't know that, we would agree because Bogdan's in the room. But most research on open source sustainability has focused on trying to keep particular projects and ecosystems alive and running. When in practice, from prior research and just from general experience, we know projects are still going to die. And projects are abandoned every day, leaving their users to have to kind of face the consequences and deal with it. And so what we are really excited to do in this project is try to understand and help people deal with it when their open source dependencies become abandoned and help them sustainably use open source. So what we investigate specifically in this project is looking at how developers prepare for and deal with abandonment of open source dependencies, or we'll just call it like dependency abandonment for short from now on. So that is pretty much our research question. The way that we wanted to do this is by kind of like listening to the experiences of developers in the past and kind of learn about how in previous experiences where they've actually come in contact with abandoned dependency, how they actually dealt with it in those instances. So we ran semi-structured interviews and we identified our participants by kind of reverse engineering it. We first identified several projects on GitHub that were very popular and that had a bunch of people depending on them, but that these projects had become abandoned. And then we used the dependency network to identify the projects that had depended on these projects. And then we found the people who worked on these dependent projects and reached out to them, and those were our interviewees. And so we talked to them about things like how they identified dependency abandonment, how they were impacted by dependency abandonment, and then how they dealt with dependency abandonment. So our project was planned to have two prongs to our methodology. The first part was qualitatively analyzing the interviews. And the second was designing and preparing a wide-scale survey to kind of validate and expand on the topics that were identified in the smaller scale qualitative interviews. So what we've done so far is we have qualitatively analyzed all of our interviews. We ended up speaking with 31 interviewees. However, we're kind of still going back and forth, and we're running more interviews. Like there's one tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. So we're not totally done yet with the qualitative analysis, but there are some kind of cool findings so far that I just wanted to talk to you guys about. The first is we wanted to kind of understand, how do developers identify when a project has become unmaintained in the first place? And what we found was that by and large, developers tend to have to just put in manual effort to identify this information on their own. So they have to go and look at the dependency project and they have to check out the project characteristics, or they would often kind of look through for a notice of abandonment or archival on the project. That would sometimes be a note in a README, or it would be a message in an issue thread about the maintenance status of said project. And so in general, most people tended to use lots of like manual effort when they were identifying abandonment. Some people used automated flags, but they had their limitations. The next thing that we identified was we wanted to understand, well, how do people prepare for the risk, or do they at all, of dependency abandonment? And what we learned was that two of the major ways that people tend to prepare for the risk of dependency abandonment is by kind of minimizing the number of dependencies that they rely on in general and building abstraction layers. into their code. These abstraction layers allowed them to really easily, in some cases, switch to another dependency. And they talked about how in other circumstances, when they didn't have this, they would have to dig through like their entire code base and find every instance where they ever mentioned a dependency. And by preparing in advance and implementing some sort of middleware or abstraction layer upon dependency adoption, they were able to save themselves a lot of headache later. Another interesting thing that I want to mention is one of our interviewees talked about how in order to minimize the number of dependencies, their development team actually had this interesting role I've never heard of before called a sustainability engineer. And part of the sustainability engineer's job was just to go through the code base and remove and replace unnecessary or concerning dependencies. So by doing this, they were able to essentially break down dependency management, which is often seen as a large, daunting task, into a much more manageable and kind of like bite-sized pieces, just every sprint making a little bit of progress on it. So I thought those were some interesting things. And then the second thing that we want to talk about is how developers actually dealt with dependency abandonment. And what we found that it is that it is often a trial and error kind of style process that includes multiple steps. The most common ways that people dealt with abandonment was switching to an alternative, forking or vendoring the code from the dependency, or seeking support from others. And what would happen a lot of times is it would be something like, oh no, they realize that it's abandoned. So they go on the project and they're seeking support from others. They're looking at, issue threads and discussions, and they're asking questions, and they're trying to evaluate what are potential solutions. And then maybe they'll see in one of these discussions a suggestion from another fellow user that says, oh, hey, try this other dependency. And then they'll go ahead and switch to a dependency. So it'll kind of be a process like that. But one thing that we noticed in general is that there were a lot of questions and essentially no consensus within our interviewees on whether to prepare or whether to not prepare, because some people would say that proactive responses could help them more quickly kind of deal with dependency abandonment when it happened. But some other people would argue that, well, they only deal with problems once there's a problem, because dealing proactively with dependency abandonment can not scale sometimes. And it can also, adding things like abstraction layers can complicate code bases and make future maintenance more complicated, and maybe make it harder to integrate new maintainers. So that it seems like in general, there's kind of this balance between like, in what cases and for what dependencies is it even appropriate to proactively versus reactively react. And so I think that future work should kind of look more onto this, and work also trying to work on this kind of narrative and figure it out. So yeah, I'm going to skip over this because I've run out of time. But so the overview of the next steps is, again, more interviews are still happening. So continuing to organize the narrative, figure it out, continue the narrative evaluation. I also initially planned on designing a follow-up survey. Still have to do that. It's been kind of challenging because this work is like very qualitative heavy. And so it's been very hard to like find the narrative and figure out how to present it. So that has taken up a lot of time and turned out to be more challenging than I expected. So just been iterating on that. And yeah, that's all I've got for now. Thank you. Oops.
Or time for one question.
One question.
I have a quick question. Courtney, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm curious because you, in order to sample your participants, you had your own metric of identifying like abandoned projects. And I was curious whether or not the participants method for identifying abandoned projects lined up with your guys' methodology at all.
Can you say that one more time?
All good. I can try. Sorry, that was a terrible idea.
I just like missed, like you said, I think so-and-so's strategy or something, but I didn't get what you said.
I have the mic in my hand now. So I was curious as to, so you are kind of, created your own ad hoc strategy for identifying abandoned projects. And I was curious like whether people's interview findings actually aligned with that sort of methodology that you applied for your research method. Does that make sense?
Like, do you mean like, did they agree with the projects that we said, like, oh, you used to depend on this project, but it was abandoned?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for the most part, yeah. I think there was some discussion about kind of the complexities behind categorizing a project as abandoned, especially in a larger context. Because, like, for example, if you have a project, like one thing that people looked at to identify an abandoned project was like, okay, is there a huge backlog of issues where like they're not responding and like there's no progress being made? And then one of our interviews was talking about kind of in defense of that not being used. They were like, yeah, well, like I've had situations where I was working on the next major version for my project and somebody made an issue post and they were like, hey, well, like you're not responding to any of these issues. So like you should like, you know, notify us that like this project isn't being maintained. And they were like, well, I am maintaining it. I'm just not responding to issues right now because I'm focusing on preparing the next major version. So I think it's a complicated thing to define. But it seems like in the like context of the questions that we were asking, yes, there seemed to be like general agreement between us and our interviewees.
Cool, thanks. I think we have to move on to the next person though.
That's good.
Should I take over or I don't mind. I guess Bogdan, you driving the slides.
Whichever is most convenient for you, I'm happy to do it either way. You're welcome to take over or have me do it.
Yep. Just go to the next slide, please. Or next slide, please. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Charity. I'm in the societal computing department. We mostly work with social media under Dr. Carly's group. So we've been looking at what's going on in Taiwan for the last year. Once Nancy Pelosi visited this past August, it definitely started drawing our attention, the military offline activity and essentially what China, tweets about Taiwan on the digital sphere. There isn't a whole lot of research on, analyzing the offline online relationship, specifically in regards to China's Taiwan policy. So this fills a very nice niche especially as the type of offline and online activity increases. And so the goal of this project was to explore those high level narratives of what China is trying to communicate to the international community, in addition to determining if there's some type of relationship between what they're saying online and what they're doing offline towards Taiwan. Next slide, please. So this project, we've literally just collected tweets from Twitter using #Taiwan from the beginning of the year. We wanted to make sure we got tweets prior to Russia's invasion into Ukraine. Additionally, we're using a secondary data set of data that Taiwan is putting out, the Ministry of Foreign Defense, for Chinese air flights that cross the median for the Taiwan Strait. And so the median line has typically been considered no man's land, even though China claims territorial integrity over the entire strait. But we've been seeing increased crossings of this median line. So that's really interesting from a kinetic activity standpoint. Additionally, we do label the data. We've got Chinese state Twitter handles, and then we ran the Twitter data through a machine learning tier-based classifier that projects a probability for each tweet, whether it was created by a bot or not. So 3 different approaches for this: topic modeling to kind of map out those high-level narratives of the data, in addition to regression modeling to determine if there is a relationship between the actual counts of tweets per day by these Chinese state accounts and the frequency of Chinese flights in Taiwan. And then the third component is the qualitative aspect of characterizing tweet activity, specifically around ADIZ areas of interest. Next slide, please. Okay, so we used a large language model to we used sentence transformer language model to create the embeddings for our topic modeling. And then I think HDB scan was used to cluster the embeddings based on text similarity. We originally got about 80 different topics, and so we had to manually combine a few topics, and then we used an auto reduction algorithm to get that number down to 30. And so based on the topics, 3 minutes. Okay, I better hurry. We were able to come up with, pretty much 5 different clusters. I've got a couple of examples for military capabilities. I'm calling this the Pelosi response for the Pelosi visit in August. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are just a couple of example tweets. The first one you can see they're very clearly advertising the encirclement campaign. These tweets are really boosting what they're doing offline, which is really interesting to see just eyeballing it. Next slide, please. I included a few of my favorite Nancy Pelosi tweets. I really like the vintage art in the bottom right. But yeah, because of the nature of the topic modeling, there are certain topics that kind of bleed over into multiple clusters. But because 75% of our data was related to Nancy Pelosi, this was a pretty large cluster. Next slide, please. Okay, so we did some generalized linear models. Poisson's really good for count-based tweets or count-based data. And so we used our 2 regression models predicting essentially, seeing if the amount of bot or state actor tweets is related to ADIZ violations. And then we use these fitted models to predict. Okay, so this just shows that bots essentially are most of our activity. State actors are a smaller component. That's just typical of an amplification campaign. Next slide, please. Okay, and we did add lagged components to this just to see, if there is a relationship between state actors and the violations within a 24-hour period. So overall, we found that there is a relationship between state and bot accounts associated to violations, and that this bot effect for lagged violations is statistically significant, but not so with state accounts. So for every additional violation on a given day, state accounts have an increase of about 5% of tweets, which is quite a lot, and bots with a lower 4%. Next slide, please.
Violations first and then tweets, right? Or the other way around?
Yeah, so violations first. We wanted to see if, there's a bidirectional relationship, and we found that state accounts and bots tweet after ADIZ violations, but not the other way around. We wanted to see, if there was a chicken and the egg effect going on between these violations, and there could be a whole host of reasons, but so far we found that this only works in one way, that the tweet effect happens after the violations. Okay, next slide. Overall, we haven't gotten to the actual qualitative components, so I hope to do this week. again, the Nancy Pelosi visit was like 75% of our Twitter data. It was huge. So kind of seeing how that Twitter chatter changes before and after is really important. And I think for the regression modeling component, actually having some type of dummy variable to account for whether an ADIZ and a tweet happened within this Pelosi month. Just, because right now our regression modeling is just averaging across all of our data. So it's not really taking into account maybe this relationship only happens in the month of August. And I just want to add, it's not a causal study, but more explanatory variables always help. People in our research group recommended adding weather. I'm not a pilot, so I'm not sure what type of weather would be important for whether a flight takes off, but it's something for me to look into. And that's it for me. I think I have like a minute for questions.
Why do you think the Chinese government would treat about things after a violation happened?
Yeah. It's a good question. My theory is that it's just part of their tactics, techniques, and procedures. Like these flights are highly visible. And so talking about them on Twitter actually boosts their effect. So if you want people to know about these flights, you want to talk about them and you want to use bots and you want to use other accounts to kind of boost that messaging. So, it makes sense to use social media to boost whatever you're doing offline if you want to advertise it.
Okay, so a very quick follow-up. When the Chinese official account tweets, do they tweet about the violation instance itself, or do they tweet about other things that may be related but not about the incident?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So they don't talk about specific events like, we launched this bomber, but they do talk about military drills. And they do talk about the areas that they're actually doing these drills. And I think one of the tweets I showed for the military capabilities cluster showed like a few example tweets of that. So those tweets are definitely, yeah, that one. So that first tweet right there, actually shows, I think those are areas that their maritime capabilities were on. So this was like both air and maritime drills, but we only have access to the air data. The ship data would be useful to have also, but it's just a constraint of this study.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Great.
All right, thank you.
I think you're next. Paula.
The wand
And the speaking.
and the, yes. Okay, okay. So I'll be presenting the initial proposal I did for my project on empirical methods on analyzing and improving documentation in composite-based robotic systems. So I'll start again with the main motivation. So we have this framework called the robot operating system, which allows you to take different components and glue them together, and you have your robotic system up and running. Unfortunately, people who develop these components that you can glue together can actually introduce some implicit biases on implicit assumptions on the way they should be used and the way that they should be composed. So you as a developer, when you are composing these systems, do not know about these implicit assumptions and may end up doing some misconfiguration issue, which can lead to an error.
And since we are working with robotic systems, sometimes these may cost thousands of dollars, millions, like the Mars Climate Orbiter. So I have developed this specification language, actually allows developers to specify the different components so that when they're trying to configure the system to glue all the components together, if there is a mismatch in the specifications, then it would raise an error. Now, at the time, I presented 3 research questions that revolved documentation. So in some prior work, there were some hints that there is a lack of documentation in the components of the robotic systems. Augmented with these implicit assumptions that are encoded with the components, the number of errors that this can lead is actually high. Now, since I started this project, the first, all these questions about documentation rely actually in one assumption. So first of all, I'm assuming that developers have implicit assumptions, and that these implicit assumptions lead to errors, and that these errors may occur because there is a lack of documentation. And I raised the question, okay, where are these errors? Where can I find the data set of these errors? And there isn't, okay? And so I actually deviated what I intended to do to try to understand what are the types of errors, what are the categories of errors that developers do by studying Ross answers, which is a sort of Stack Overflow for the robot operating system. So the main motivation is the same, but the difference is, okay, now since my language is targeting architectural issues in terms of we're trying to compose our system with different components, what I want to do is try to understand what are the categories of errors that are related to these architectural implicit assumptions that I can find on Ross answers, and use this as motivation to drive the semantics and the syntax of my language. Okay, we're good. And then see how useful is actually the specification in detecting these integration errors. So I've had this framework that I've used to mine Ross answers. I have done, and I'm still doing some analysis in terms of what are accepted answers and what are the questions with accepted answers and no answers, questions with codes, what type of source code, what type of errors do these questions have. And I've actually also been doing some manual inspection and coding of the questions, and after that build a taxonomy of categories of errors. For example, right now I've collected around 67,000 questions from Ross answers from 2011 until the day I took the snapshot of Ross answers, from which I'm only considering 27,000 questions which have an accepted answer. I'm doing this because when I'm going through the all the sample of the questions that I'm taking and I'm coding them, I want to have a baseline of, so the accepted answer not only provides a solution, but actually also a sort of interpretation of what the error may be. And if my interpretation of the error matches the interpretation of the error of the accepted answer, then I have more confidence of what I'm categorizing that question and that error. Out of these 27,000 to 12,000 have codes. So far, I've gone through 10,000 of the questions, and I've marked them as C code or Python code or a command line errors, and I also have a different type of errors. since a question may have different types of codes, we can have questions with C and Python code. Oh, this project has been adjourned. So I originally manually inspected and coded 1,500 questions, and where 156 were marked as configuration issues. However, okay, so I learned a lot throughout this course. So I noticed that there were some issues with the, I'm well on time. So I noticed that there were some issues on the methodology. And so I changed the methodology. And then I noticed that there were issues again with the methodology. And so I changed the methodology again to the current state, which I'm doing, which plans to answer these questions again, like what categories of errors are related to architectural implicit assumptions. So I'm going through the questions again and manually analyzing them and going to build the taxonomy till the end of this week. And then as for research question 2, perhaps it does not really fit the course. And what I'm actually doing is I have this case study, and after having this taxonomy, I'm going to generate synthetic bugs, introducing them into this case study and see if the language can detect these type of issues. Thank you.
A lot of manual analysis. Yeah.
Very impressive that you did 1,500 manual.
I'm crying because like, I can't really use all of that. I right, because I followed the wrong methodology.
Did you consider sampling though instead?
Yes, so what I did was, for the first methodology, I had some strict concepts, for example, node, topic, and that reduced the number of questions from 600,000 to like 30,000. And then I sampled like 368. And then I went through for each of the concepts. But when I was going through, for example, the third concept, I noticed, oh no, I'm doing something wrong. And then I changed methodology. And the second one, what I actually did was I took all 600,000 and took a sample, and then went through all of them. And out of those, I had 9 configuration issues. And then I tried to analyze patterns in the content. And from those patterns, I tried to check on the questions, okay, which questions fit these patterns? The thing is, with this approach, I'm not trying to understand what other types of issues are there in the questions, but I'm fitting to those specific type of issues. So I'm actually looking for the frequency of those issues and not the variety of the issues that exist.
Maybe you want to talk to us more about whatever, any suggestions for.
It's been a struggle.
So that maybe we can help you avoid redoing this yet again.
Yeah.
So we take this offline. I think this is from your conversation. But let's chat more about this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think you're next, Ian. I'll give you the last one.
The large button is forward. Right?
Yeah.
Perfect. So to make sure. I might have gotten the slide order wrong here. Let me take a look at this.
Is a back button and forward button. That was the back button. The one pointing to the right is the.
Ah, there we go.
Yep.
Okay, there we go. So I'm Ian McCormick, and I'll be focusing on setting healthy boundaries for function interface use in the Rust ecosystem. So Rust is a massively popular programming language these days. It's been voted the most loved on Stack Overflow's annual developer survey for the past 7 years running. It's become widely adopted in performance critical systems, ranging from popular tools like Discord to the Linux kernel now. And it has very similar performance, memory usage, and energy efficiency to C, while having the added bonus of static guarantees of memory safety. So knowing that your code is memory safe without having the runtime overhead that you find in typical memory safety approaches through garbage collection. So a lot of great reasons to use Rust here. However, Rust memory safety is somewhat shaky in the sense that within this larger Rust ecosystem of packages that you can download and use in your projects, greater than 20% based on surveys from data ranging from 2018 to 2020 contains something called unsafe code. And in this case, unsafe Rust code disables all of the nice, great safety guarantees that you can have in your Rust programs, and lets you do things that are very similar to what you can do in C. So essentially introducing a lot of memory errors and potential vulnerabilities. So in general, the main approach here that you see commonly used is to handle this is something called interior unsafety. And this fits a typical approach of information hiding that you'll see in software engineering, where you have this external interface surrounding the internal implementation details you just worry about. In this case, you have a safe Rust interface that other developers will actually use and consume and use in their projects, covering up your unsafe Rust code within. So it sort of mitigates this danger of this unsafe code by constraining it to one location. This is a great model, and it's been used in research to examine unsafe code. However, for particular types of unsafe code, in particular foreign function calls, this is not adequate because there are actually a couple more layers to this Rust lasagna that matter that we need to look at. So in this case, when you're dealing with an application that uses foreign functions, you have two additional layers of abstraction that you need to engage with. And these are the foreign bindings that you have. So you have your unsafe Rust code, and then you actually have declared function headers that represent the behavior implemented in another language like C or C#. So these have to be declared correctly with the right types, with the right interface matching what you've actually written in that other language. And then, of course, you have the code in the other language, which is in a separate file or a separate binary, and is a completely different memory model potentially than Rust, and can do a lot of other unsafe things. So there are multiple implications here on being able to sort of mitigate this danger of unsafety that existing studies don't consider, and they generally fall into these two layers. So that's going to be our focus in this particular study, is looking at these two layers and seeing how they impact unsafe Rust within the ecosystem overall. So the types of questions that I'm addressing fall into generally two categories. First is targeting that previous layer of foreign bindings. So we're looking at how developers declare their foreign functions in Rust, and considering sort of what types of foreign bindings are used, are they declared correctly, and then also are they typed correctly? Are developers using the right types? And then if they are not, why? So what are the limitations of the compiler that developers are running up against? This last question is more of a sequential explanatory question, in the sense that we're sampling type errors and then doing some qualitative analysis of the code in which they are found. And then for the second aspect of this study, we're going to be looking at the interaction between the bottom of the stack and the top of the stack. So the main idea here is foreign code introduces additional constructs that you have to deal with in Rust, in particular, explicit memory management. So we're going to take a look at where we have these foreign functions used in Rust libraries. How do the features of the foreign languages that are being encapsulated or sort of wrapped up in this lasagna, how do those influence how it looks from the top? So what practices do developers have to use in addition to those that they would generally use for any arbitrary unsafe Rust lasagna, but that are particular to this situation where you have foreign code? I just realized I've had to make some last minute changes to the remainder of this presentation. So I think the rest at this point is not accurate as of new data that I'm seeing. And given that I only have 2 minutes, I think I'm going to stop here, just because it doesn't make sense for me to continue. without us having to update the slide deck. That's the overall introduction structure to my research.
I just want to say that you had me at Rust Design.
Yeah, thank you. Sam?
So earlier in your slides, you mentioned a 20% number.
Mhm.
I was curious on the exact definition of that number. My understanding is that, because you said depends on unsafe. And my understanding is that the Rust standard library uses a whole lot of unsafe code, so I would expect that number to be 100%. So what do you mean exactly?
Gotcha. So yeah, that could have been worded better. That meant within packages of the Rust ecosystem that have unsafe code declared within them.
Okay, so
so-
not in their dependencies, like
Yeah,
20% of crates use unsafe in the crate.
yes.
Okay.
So that would include the standard library as well as just any other library distributed through crates.io. If you look at in terms of like, it depends on transitively, it ends up being, I think the most recent survey was like 50%.
So when transitively, you mean like transitive dependencies except for the standard library?
Including the standard library.
Including,
Or wait, no, yeah, except for the standard library.
okay.
Yeah.
So for the 20, I guess for either of those numbers, you're just looking at like proportion of crates and you don't weight by like crate size or crate popularity or any of those things.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, one other thing we did, I was watching this talk in preparation for your talk today. Some guy talking about unsafe Rust. And he was arguing that there's all kinds of valid, reasonable use cases for unsafe, so it's not. You're almost left with no alternative, if you're in one of those situations, but to use unsafe. So how do you reconcile that? It seems that's sort of painted as a negative, be avoided thing here.
Yeah, so the literature identifies 6 use cases for unsafe that are unavoidable, which range from performance gains that you can only achieve through low-level interaction to cases where you have to have something unsafe because it requires certain preconditions that developers have to provide that the Rust compiler can't provide for them. So it's like a documentation feature. I think a better way of phrasing it than how I implied in this presentation, I think would be that unsafe is inherently dangerous, but necessary, and that we should understand how and where it is used because of the potential for danger, but we should accept that it's like 23 to 29% number of direct unsafe within Rust is always going to be there, likely.
I guess following up on that, I remember earlier in your presentation, you said that using unsafe like disables all of the memory safety that Rust gives you.
Mhm.
My understanding is that it's not entirely true. It only enables like a particular subset of features that you otherwise wouldn't be able to use, but like the rest of the type system still has. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it disables the borrow checker for that particular region of unsafe code. Yeah, so like you don't have that's been my understanding. I'm not sure if that's like, if I'm wrong there.
No, it doesn't.
But
It
yeah,
doesn't disable borrow checker. It just enables you to do like certain things with pointers and other like FFI and other things.
I guess I was interpreting the options that the operations you can use on the raw pointer types as being manipulating memory in a way that is
Right.
bypassing the borrow checker. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that's a more accurate way of stating it.
Yeah, because it doesn't disable the borrow checker for using references, but you're right. It allows you to use pointers. Like you can't.
Yeah.
What's next for the project?
So I currently have a tool for collecting quantitative data that answers the first 2 research questions and half of the third one. But the qualitative analysis, which is the 3rd and 4th research questions that I have, is sort of dependent on the results from that tool. And I discovered a major validity issue on Tuesday. So I will have full quantitative results, but the qualitative analysis is pending an additional run, which takes about a week. So.